Hello and welcome to this Anatomy Physiology Bio 201 video lecture on the spinal cord and nerves. I'm Mr. Kennedy and I'll be your guide as we briefly explore this topic together. We begin today by considering the functions of the spinal cord. The spinal cord processes reflexes, integrates excitatory postsynaptic potentials and inhibitory postsynaptic potentials, and conducts sensory impulses to the brain and motor impulses to effectors. The spinal cord is well protected, as seen here to the right. The spinal cord is protected by bone in the form of vertebra, connective tissue in the form of meninges, and fluid in the form of cerebrospinal fluid. Take a moment to familiarize yourself with each structure labeled in the picture to the right. The meninges. The meninges are composed of three layers, the dura, arachnoid, and pia mater. Take a moment to examine the picture at the right to identify those three structures. The external anatomy of the spinal cord. The spinal cord begins as an extension of the medulla oblongata at the level of the foramen magnum and terminates at the level of L2. Here we see at the right the spinal cord and the major plexes. Take a moment to examine each before moving on. The internal anatomy of the spinal cord is illustrated through this transverse section of the lumbar spine. Take a moment to familiarize yourself with each of the labeled structures in this transverse section. Here you can see a slightly different view of a transverse section of the lumbar spinal cord. What's most interesting here is the distinct white versus gray matter. Take a moment to again familiarize yourself with the labeled structures in this picture. Sensory and motor processing. The internal anatomy of the spinal cord allows sensory and motor information to be processed in an organized way. Here we see incoming sensory information. We see it processed as it enters the spinal cord and a response generated exiting the opposite side. Spinal nerves. Spinal nerves connect the central nervous system to sensory receptors, muscles, and glands, and are part of the peripheral nervous system. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Anterior and posterior roots attach a spinal nerve to a segment of the spinal cord. The connective tissue covering of a spinal nerve is illustrated here. Be sure to note each. We have the epineurium, perineurium, and endoneurium. Branches of a spinal nerve. Shortly after passing through its intervertebral foramina, a spinal nerve divides into several branches known as rami. Those are illustrated in the diagram below. Here we see the cervical plexus. Take a moment to note its location and a few of the major nerves that branch off. Next, we see the brachial plexus. Again, take a moment to note its location and a few of the major nerves that branch off. Here we see the brachial plexus as the nerve endings subsequently travel down the arm. This is the lumbar plexus. Again, note its location and the major nerves that branch off. Here we see the lumbar plexus as the nerves traveling from it extend down the leg. Take a moment to again familiarize yourself with the major nerves that branch off of the lumbar plexus. This is the sacral plexus. Note its location and the major nerve branching off. Here we see the sacral plexus and the nerves extending from it down the leg. Dermatomes. Certain skin segments are supplied with spinal nerves that carry somatic sensory nerve impulses to the brain. Those segments of skin are referred to as dermatomes and are illustrated in the picture to the right. Spinal cord physiology. How does information travel in the spinal cord? White matter tracts conduct nerve impulses to and from the brain. Gray matter receives and integrates incoming and outgoing information to perform spinal reflexes. Here we see the sensory and motor tracts in the spinal cord. It's important to note their location and understand that sensory tracts are taking information from outside the spinal cord in and up through the spinal cord to the brain, while motor tracts are doing the exact opposite. Reflexes and reflex arcs. A reflex is a fast, predictable, automatic response to changes in the environment. Reflexes help maintain homeostasis. The spinal cord serves as the integrating center for spinal reflexes. Integration takes place in the gray matter of the spinal cord. This is an illustration of a simple reflex arc. Note that a sensory receptor receives a stimulus, in this case a nail or a pin in the skin, and that stimulus is sent through a sensory neuron into the spinal cord, where an interneuron integrates that stimulus and generates an appropriate response through a motor neuron to an effector muscle. Some important vocabulary to remember with regard to reflex arcs is listed here. Stretch reflexes. Stretch reflexes control muscle length by causing muscle contraction. The stereotypical reflex test in a doctor's office, where you're hit in the knee with a mallet, is an example of a stretch reflex. The mallet causes a stretch in the patellar tendon that then results in you kicking your foot. Tendon reflexes control muscle tension by causing muscle relaxation. Flexor or withdrawal reflexes. Withdrawal reflexes move a limb to avoid injury or pain. This is the stereotypical reflex that occurs when you touch something that's hot, or as illustrated here, maybe step on something that's sharp. Crossed-extensor reflexes help maintain balance. Homeostatic imbalances. Damage that results from traumatic injury depends on the degree of spinal cord section or the degree of compression of the segments involved. This concludes our coverage of the spinal cord and nerves.